December 19, 1944, 0340 hours, somewhere east of Bastogne. The forest is silent in the way only deep winter can make it. Snow muffles everything, footsteps, engines, even fear. You can almost hear the cold itself cracking the branches overhead. Then it comes, a low vibration, not thunder, not artillery, something heavier, mechanical, moving. A German staff officer steps out of a command dugout, collar pulled tight against the wind. He pauses, listens. The sound doesn't make sense. According to every map pinned inside that bunker, nothing with tracks should be coming from that direction. The roads are wrong. The terrain is wrong. The weather makes it impossible. And yet the ground is shaking. Minutes later, binoculars catch the first dark shapes sliding between the trees. Not infantry, not half-tracks. American tanks. Shermans. Coming from the south. From a direction German generals had ruled out entirely. Just 72 hours earlier, the German High Command had been celebrating something close to resurrection. The Ardennes offensive, Whacked 'em Rhine, had slammed into thin American lines with stunning success. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. Snow choked roads. U.S. divisions were cut off, confused, retreating. For the first time in years, German commanders felt momentum. They had studied the terrain obsessively. The Ardennes Forest was their shield. Narrow roads, steep hills, dense woods. In winter, it became a natural fortress. Allied armor, they believed, could only move along a few predictable routes, and those routes were already under German guns. The southern flank, especially, was considered safe. Too far, too frozen, too slow. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel had written it plainly. Any major armored movement from the south would require days, if not weeks. Those words were barely dry. Inside a drafty schoolhouse in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton stood over a map table lit by bare bulbs. The Third Army commander hadn't slept properly in days. His face was drawn, eyes sharp, jaw set. Snow clung to the treads of boots crowded around him. Staff officers, aides, signalmen. Patton didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "We're turning north," he said, tapping the map once with a gloved finger. "All of it." Someone hesitated. "Sir, that's a 90-degree pivot." Patton looked up slowly. "I know exactly what it is." The room went still. A 90-degree pivot in combat, in winter, with an entire army. No Allied force had ever attempted anything like it under fire. Patton had already done the math. Back in the Ardennes, German commanders were busy consolidating gains. Reports spoke of captured fuel dumps, shattered American units, prisoners moving east in columns. Confidence spread. The belief hardened that the southern flank was secure. Then the reports began to change. First, a field message intercepted by German signals intelligence. American traffic, heavy traffic, units that were supposed to be facing east, now turning north. Dismissed as confusion. Then aerial reconnaissance, brief gaps in cloud, showed long columns of vehicles moving on roads that weren't supposed to be used in winter. Snowplows, engineers, bridging units. Still, staff officers reassured their generals. "It cannot be armor." The map said so. On December 18th, the temperature dropped further. Roads iced over. Visibility collapsed. Exactly the conditions German planners believed would paralyze the Americans. Instead, U.S. engineers worked through the night. Bulldozers pushed snow aside. MPs redirected traffic with glowing batons. Drivers followed headlights bumper to bumper, hour after hour. Orders were short, clear, relentless. Move north. No matter what. Patton's Third Army was on the clock. Late that night, in a German command post near Clervaux, an operations officer unfolded a fresh situation map. He hesitated. A red grease pencil mark appeared where none should exist. Then another. American armored elements reported southwest of Bastogne. That wasn't possible. He checked the grid, checked it again. The roads there were narrow, winding, elevated. In December, they were death traps. He brought the map to his superior. The general stared at it silent. Finally, he said, "Confirm." Confirmation came just before dawn. Forward observers reported tank engines echoing through the valleys, not scattered vehicles, formations, coordinated, disciplined, moving with purpose. A German lieutenant wrote in his field notebook, "Enemy armor advancing from sector deemed impassable, maps inaccurate or assumptions flawed." Another officer was less measured. "They are coming through the forest," he said. "How is this possible?" No one answered. By the morning of December 19th, German radio traffic had shifted tone. The confidence was gone, replaced by clipped voices, urgency, questions. Where were these units coming from? How many? How fast? Most disturbing of all, who was commanding them? The answer, once it surfaced, traveled fast. Patton. The same general German officers had been warned about in Sicily, in France, the one known for speed, for aggression, for doing what doctrine said not to do. Now his tanks were appearing where the maps promised safety. And Bastogne, still holding, still resisting, was no longer isolated. Not anymore. As the sun crept over the frozen tree line, German commanders faced a realization that cut deeper than the cold. The Americans hadn't reacted slowly. They had already arrived. And Patton's pivot was only just beginning. Snow whipped across the Ardennes like white knives, stinging exposed faces and turning every breath into smoke. You can almost taste the metallic bite of winter on the wind. The U.S. Third Army's column of Sherman tanks churned through the ice-choked forest roads, treads crunching over frozen mud, engines growling against the howling gusts. Every vehicle was packed: infantry, artillery, fuel, supplies. Engineers marched ahead, breaking ice, shoring up bridges, clearing fallen trees. Nothing could stop them. Patton rode in a staff car, coat collar high, cigar smoldering between his teeth despite the snow. His eyes scanned the map, the roads, the formations. He didn't look nervous. He looked alive. Every mile north, every frozen hill crested, was a gamble. If the column stalled, if the bridges gave way, if the German forces intercepted before the pivot completed, the whole army could be trapped. But Patton had calculated the risk. The Germans expected paralysis. They expected indecision. They assumed the winter forest would protect their flank. That was their mistake. Meanwhile, in German command posts, alarm grew into disbelief. Staff officers scoured their maps, marking every road and secondary path. None of them led to where the Shermans were now reported. Every assumption was wrong. Every calculation flawed. General Hasso von Manteuffel paced, muttering into his phone lines. Reports streamed in, intercepted from his own forward units, that American armor was moving along routes his maps had labeled impassable. "Impossible," one officer whispered. "They cannot be here." "Check again," Manteuffel snapped. "It must be an error, radios malfunctioning, reconnaissance wrong." But the confirmations kept coming. Tanks, trucks, engineers, all moving northward through terrain thought blocked by snow and frost. Bastogne, surrounded by German forces for days, suddenly had hope flickering in the form of the Third Army's approach. Patton's staff worked feverishly. Signals officers sent encrypted orders, artillery units were repositioned, and infantry units shifted to maintain momentum. The pace was relentless. Men fought not just the cold, but fatigue, ice, and the ever-present threat of ambush. Every mile gained was a small miracle, a testament to discipline and daring combined. By midday, scouts reported contact with forward American units already skirmishing with German patrols near Bastogne's outskirts. The momentum was undeniable. Tanks crashed through trees, machine guns rattled, artillery boomed. German positions that were supposed to be safe were suddenly under assault from directions no one had expected. In a frozen bunker near Hufeleis, General von Leutwitz and his officers stared at the latest intercepts. His hands shook slightly as he laid out the map, tracing the routes the Americans had taken. Patton, one junior officer, said quietly, "He's doing exactly what we feared. We thought it impossible, yet here he is." Von Leutwitz didn't respond. He couldn't. For hours, the reports kept rolling in: more tanks, more infantry, more supply columns, defying every assumption German commanders had made about terrain, weather, and Allied caution. The realization hit like a hammer. The Ardennes could not be sealed off. Bastogne might not fall, not with this force racing through frozen forests and defying every expectation. By late afternoon, the first Sherman tanks rumbled into artillery range of Bastogne. Soldiers on the streets spotted familiar U.S. insignias gleaming under the gray winter sky. Exhausted but determined, they waved, shouted, some even laughed in disbelief. German officers watched this on their own maps, symbols marking advancing units, and finally, the first seeds of panic took root. They were supposed to be dictating the pace of the battle. Instead, the battle dictated itself around them, led by a general who refused to let weather or terrain limit his army's will. Somewhere on the radio net, a German lieutenant barked into the microphone, "They are everywhere we thought impossible." The words hung in the freezing air like a confession. And yet for Patton, this was just the beginning. One forest, one road, one pivot at a time, the Third Army pressed forward, leaving stunned German commanders to wonder if their maps had been written by fools, or if they had simply underestimated the man commanding the tanks. Night fell over the Ardennes like a velvet shroud, but the snow didn't soften the tension, it amplified it. You could hear it, the low rumble of tanks in the distance, the occasional rifle crack, the howl of the wind through skeletal trees. Inside German command posts, officers huddled over maps illuminated by flickering lamps. Lines and markers seemed to jump, as if mocking them. Everywhere they looked, the impossible had arrived. By now, intercepted radio transmissions were piling up. The Germans had been trained to expect delays, to predict movements with cold precision. Yet every report from forward units, every scrambled message, told the same story. American armor moving along routes deemed impassable, converging toward Bastogne faster than any plan could anticipate. Field Marshal Model's headquarters received the news late in the evening. He read the intercepts in silence, eyes narrowing as the implications sank in. Patton's army is not just moving, it's appearing where we said it could not. He rubbed his jaw. Officers around him shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Maps had failed them. Intelligence had failed them. And now their own troops were caught off guard. Inside Bastogne, American soldiers, cold and exhausted, heard the distant growl of approaching tanks. Hope surged. They knew the relief column meant more than just supplies, it meant survival. Sherman tanks barreled down snow-choked roads, their engines roaring through the forest like thunder. Soldiers waved from foxholes, eyes bright despite frost-bitten cheeks. Patton's personal liaison, Major General Clift, rode alongside the lead tanks. "Sir," he shouted over the noise, "they didn't think we could come this way." Patton's grin was almost imperceptible beneath frost. "Of course they didn't. They never do." That simple sentence, delivered into the storm, summed up weeks of preparation, calculation, and boldness. Patton had anticipated the disbelief. He had banked on it. And now the payoff was visible in the mud-streaked faces of his men and the column of tanks cutting through the forest. Back in German headquarters, officers frantically recalculated. Supply lines, artillery positions, ambush points, all irrelevant. The Ardennes offensive had been planned as a precise hammer strike, but the hammer had been caught off guard. Now they scrambled to reposition units, but Patton's pivot was already too fast. Every new movement felt like chasing shadows in snow. Captain Richter, in a radio bunker near St. Vith, recorded in his log, enemy units appearing where no one expected. Commanders stunned. Cannot predict next movement. Even veteran generals, men who had fought in France, North Africa, and Russia, admitted privately they had never seen anything like it. A tank column emerging where maps said impassable. Roads they swore frozen solid, now alive with engines and steel. Bastogne, isolated only hours ago, suddenly becoming a focal point of American strength. Meanwhile, Patton's staff worked relentlessly to maintain momentum. Supply trucks, artillery, engineers. They moved like clockwork, as if the snow itself obeyed orders. Every mile gained was measured, not just in ground but in psychological advantage. The Germans, who had assumed static defenses, were now reacting, improvising, panicked. Patton didn't wait for perfection. He exploited every gap, every narrow valley, every ice-slick road. Forward units scouted aggressively, artillery barrages cleared obstacles, and tanks pressed forward even when bridges groaned under their weight. It was audacious. It was impossible. And it worked. In the German command posts, disbelief hardened into fear. General von Leutwitz and his staff stared at the updated maps, red pencil marks spreading like veins. How can this be? One officer asked. The room was silent except for the occasional click of a radio. They had assumed the Americans would be slowed. They had assumed the forests and winter would protect their flank. Instead, their worst nightmare was unfolding. The words repeated in officers' minds. Where the map said impassable, the enemy appeared. And that realization carried a weight heavier than artillery, deeper than frost, sharper than any blade. They were no longer in control. The Ardennes, once a playground of German planning, had become Patton's stage. By midnight, the first Sherman tanks were within striking distance of Bastogne's outskirts. Forward observers reported skirmishes along secondary roads. German officers, reading the intercepted radio chatter, noted an eerie calm in the American voice transmissions. Discipline, coordination, speed. They were witnessing a general operating on instinct and audacity, bending terrain, weather, and expectation to his will. The Ardennes offensive, meticulously planned, was unraveling in real time. And at the heart of it, one question gnawed at every German commander. How could one man turn impossibility into reality? December 20th, 1944. Pre-dawn gray settled over Bastogne. The town was still scarred from relentless artillery, streets littered with debris, buildings hollowed by shells. Yet the frozen mud now bore a new sound, tracks of Sherman tanks rolling over cobblestones, engines rumbling like distant thunder. American soldiers peered out from foxholes, wide-eyed, breath misting in the frigid air. Relief had arrived. Patton himself was there, standing atop a hill overlooking the town. The wind whipped his coat, tugged at his gloves, carried with it the cries of his soldiers and the faint echoes of distant German artillery. He didn't speak much. His eyes scanned the northern approach, noting every ridge, every choke point, every avenue for armor to press the advantage. Bastogne was no longer an isolated pocket. It was alive again, a bulwark for the Third Army. Inside German command posts, the effect of Patton's arrival was devastating. Communications were frantic. Officers shouted across rooms, charts were overturned, phones rung off the hook. Signals intelligence had tracked the movement for hours, but seeing tanks appear in Bastogne, where they should not have been able to reach, triggered panic. General von Leutwitz slammed a fist onto a table. "This is impossible," he barked. "Every assumption, every calculation, every map wrong." Officers exchanged helpless glances. German forces had counted on Bastogne's isolation to wear down the American defenders. That isolation had just evaporated. The morale effect was immediate. Forward German units, expecting trapped Americans, were now confronted with reinforced opposition, artillery covering avenues previously open, and tanks ready to engage. Hesitation crept in. Confusion spread. Where commanders had expected compliance, they encountered resistance bolstered by Patton's audacity. Meanwhile, Patton orchestrated his next moves. Infantry units were synchronized with armor, supply lines pushed forward, engineers repairing frozen roads as they advanced. Artillery was strategically repositioned to cover every vulnerable approach, anticipating German counterattacks. This was operational art in motion, a ballet of mechanics and human endurance. Every tank, every truck, every rifleman executed the plan with precision. Yet the human element never left Patton's calculations. He walked among his soldiers, spoke briefly with squad leaders, checked maps with aides. His presence reminded everyone that the pivot had purpose, discipline, and urgency. Every man knew they were part of something historic. German commanders struggled to respond. Orders crossed conflicting radio channels. Units were repositioned, often into places already compromised. The Ardennes, designed as a fortress of calculated control, had become a battlefield of reaction rather than strategy. Hasso von Manteuffel reportedly said to an aide, "Patton moves where we dared not even imagine. He forces us to fight his fight, not ours." The psychological impact was just as crucial as the physical one. German soldiers, once confident in their occupation of the Ardennes, now felt the weight of an unpredictable opponent. Tanks they assumed would never appear in this frozen southern sector were arriving in force. Bastogne was reinforced, Bastogne could hold, and Patton's momentum could not be stopped. By late afternoon, Patton's Shermans had linked with the defenders of Bastogne. Soldiers embraced, shared rations, and exchanged exhausted but triumphant smiles. Relief was tangible, yet Patton did not pause. His orders already mapped the next day's objectives, and his mind calculated the German responses with clinical precision. The German generals, by contrast, had entered the first stage of panic. Maps were now useless, assumptions shattered, and time compressed into a relentless countdown of American pressure. Every decision carried the weight of the impossible: anticipate Patton or be outmaneuvered. And one chilling fact had begun to sink in. Patton had not only defied the terrain, the weather, and the maps, but he had also shattered the very confidence of Germany's top commanders. Their own belief in impossibility had been weaponized against them. As night descended on Bastogne, fires from burning vehicles cast jagged shadows. You could hear tanks idling, radios crackling, and soldiers whispering prayers and stories to keep warm. Patton's Third Army had turned the tables in hours, not days. The impossible pivot had succeeded. But even as soldiers slept fitfully under blankets and snow, somewhere in the Ardennes, German commanders plotted, and they were beginning to ask themselves the same question they had avoided all day. Could one man's audacity truly undo weeks of strategy? December 21st, 1944. Mid-morning. German headquarters across the Ardennes were thick with smoke from stoves and cigarettes, but no fire could warm the fear inside. Officers huddled over maps and reports, eyes darting from intercepted transmissions to the ground reports streaming in from the front. Every symbol on the maps now felt like a betrayal. Every X marked on paper contradicted reality. General Hasso von Manteuffel finally spoke, voice low but sharp. "We cannot fight this as we planned. He is everywhere we assumed impossible." His staff froze. There it was, the admission they had feared but refused to say aloud. Patton was not only present, he was dictating the battlefield. Elsewhere, small units of American soldiers felt it too. You can almost hear the tension in the frozen air, Patton's orders cascading down, vehicles moving in unison, artillery booming in coordination. Sherman tanks smashed through forested obstacles, flanking German units that had thought themselves safe. Infantry followed closely, ready to exploit every weakness. Every soldier in the Third Army moved like part of a single organism, a machine tuned to audacity. Bastogne, which had held under siege for days, was no longer isolated. Supply trucks rumbled through ice-choked roads. Medic teams arrived to evacuate the wounded. Engineers repaired bridges that German planners had assumed would remain impassable. The town's defenders, exhausted, could hardly believe the sight. Patton had arrived where no one dared imagine. Inside a German communications post, Lieutenant Richter whispered into the phone, voice tense. "Sir, Sherman tanks Bastogne, approaching from the south." A pause, then, "Impossible, check again." They checked, twice, three times. Every field report said the same thing. Armor moving where maps had forbidden it. Roads the generals had marked as death traps were now channels of advance. Every assumption shattered in minutes. The disbelief transformed into something heavier: fear. Commanders who had felt in control were now reacting, improvising, chasing shadows in the snow. The Ardennes offensive had been designed to dictate the pace of war. Instead, it now moved to the rhythm of Patton's audacity. Patton, for his part, pressed on. There was no celebration, no pause. Every second mattered. He studied German positions, anticipated counterattacks, and continued coordinating his armored columns. Radio messages were crisp, clear, and precise. Every officer, every gunner, every driver knew their place. His audacity was contagious, his momentum unstoppable. By afternoon, the first coordinated clashes outside Bastogne signaled a turning point. German units, already stretched thin, scrambled to reposition, only to be caught by flanking Shermans and American infantry. Reports of surrender began trickling in, small pockets of resistance crumbling under the pressure of speed, coordination, and relentless force. In the German command posts, the atmosphere had shifted from disbelief to grim recognition. Maps lay spread across tables like discarded toys. Calculations once trusted were worthless. Officers muttered about audacity, luck, and impossibility. Even veteran generals, hardened by years of war across Europe and North Africa, admitted privately that they had never seen maneuver like this. One senior officer, nodding the chaos on his maps, scribbled, "Patton does what we never imagined. He moves where we said no one could. He dictates the battle. Bastogne survives because of him." It was a bitter pill. The Ardennes offensive, meticulously planned and expected to crush isolated American units, had been turned on its head. A single general, using speed, calculation, and unyielding daring, had undone weeks of preparation in days. As night fell over the Ardennes once more, the German high command faced a sobering truth. They had been outmaneuvered not just tactically but psychologically. Patton's pivot, the 90-degree gamble through frozen forests, had rewritten the battlefield. Confidence had shattered. Plans had failed. And the commanders were left asking the same haunting question over and over. How do you stop a man who refuses to be stopped? The Third Army, exhausted but triumphant, rested for a moment in the snow. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for now, the impossible had been achieved. Patton had turned disbelief into awe. And the maps, once considered sacred, had failed entirely. December 22, 1944. Dawn broke pale and gray over the Ardennes. Snow crusted every branch, every road, every abandoned German foxhole. The battlefield was quiet, but tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Patton's Third Army had completed the pivot. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and supply units were positioned around Bastogne, their presence breathing life into a town that had just days before been thought doomed. Patton rode along the front, inspecting units, nodding to soldiers, checking maps with aides. The air smelled of fuel, gunpowder, and melting snow. Exhausted men moved like clockwork, yet their eyes glimmered with the thrill of survival and triumph. They had witnessed audacity in motion, the kind that turns impossibility into reality. Far to the east, German commanders tried to recalibrate. General von Leutwitz and Field Marshal Model pored over reports, tracing the paths Patton had taken through terrain they had deemed impassable. Each report was a blow. Bridges crossed, roads cleared, units repositioned faster than they could respond. The Ardennes offensive, carefully timed and calculated, had stalled. Confidence turned into doubt, doubt into fear. One officer wrote in his diary, "Patton moves where we cannot follow. Our maps are useless against him. Bastogne is no longer a trap. It is a threat." Even Hasso von Manteuffel, known for his cool-headed precision, admitted privately that the Third Army's maneuver had fundamentally altered the campaign. Patton's audacity was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological weapon, breaking the Germans' assumptions, forcing hesitation, and seizing the initiative. Back in Bastogne, Patton met with General Anthony McAuliffe, the American commander who had famously replied "nuts" to German surrender demands. They surveyed the town from a hill overlooking the snow-packed streets. Soldiers repaired fortifications, distributed rations, and treated the wounded. The air was tense but triumphant. Bastogne had held, and the pivot of the Third Army had made it possible. Patton spoke quietly, almost to himself. "They believed the maps. We moved anyway. That's how wars are won." It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was planning, courage, and relentless momentum. Every soldier in that army understood they were part of something historic, witnessing audacity shape reality, where assumptions failed and human will overcame frozen terrain and formidable opposition. The German generals could only react. They had miscalculated speed, underestimated audacity, and over-relied on maps and doctrine. Intercepted reports show confusion spreading down to divisional commanders. Units prepared for attacks that would never come, redeployed too late, and lost critical time. Patton had forced them into a defensive posture, controlling the tempo and denying them initiative. By the end of December 22nd, the tactical situation was clear. The Ardennes offensive's southern flank had been neutralized, Bastogne held, and the Third Army's audacious maneuver had reasserted Allied dominance. Patton's reputation was cemented, not merely as a commander of tanks and men, but as a master of psychological warfare, audacity, and timing. The winter sun dipped low over snow-laden pines. Sherman tanks glinted in the fading light. Soldiers moved along roads, fatigued, cold, but unstoppable. Somewhere in the Ardennes, German generals sat in silence, staring at maps that had promised victory, now reduced to guides of impossibility. Patton's pivot, the 90-degree gamble through frozen forests, had done more than save Bastogne. It had shattered confidence, rewritten expectations, and reminded the world of the terrifying potential of audacity in war. And the lesson lingered in every German report, every diary entry, every whispered confession. Never underestimate a general who refuses to be limited by maps, terrain, or winter. History would remember Bastogne, not just as a siege, but as the moment one army moved where the world said it could not, and forced even the most disciplined commanders into disbelief. Patton had arrived where maps promised impossibility, and the battlefield would never be the same. End